Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to ARA's Webinar Wednesday. I am Sri Rao, your moderator for today's webinar titled Expanding the Horizon for Asset Management, Transportation Asset Management Beyond Bridge and Pavement Assets. Now, I would like to introduce our first presenter, my colleague and friend, Neil James. Neil is a staff research analyst and transportation planner at ARA with over 3 years of experience. His area of expertise is focused on research management and program support, technology deployment, asset management, planning, and communications. He has led and supported research in technology deployment, innovation, and infrastructure related to electric vehicles, intelligent transportation systems, ITS, connected and automated vehicles, transportation system management and operations, TISMO, and asset management. Sorry. Neil, welcome, and please begin, and thank you for presenting today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sri. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being on the webinar Wednesday today. As stated, my name is Neil James, a staff research analyst and transportation planner with Applied Research Associates. Today, we'll be covering a variety of topics within asset management, including asset management principles, current practices within asset management and ancillary assets. We'll also have time for questions and discussions at the end. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll find a list of acronyms that we will be using throughout the presentation, although we will do our best to avoid jargon throughout. We found it important to lay the foundation within asset management and provide an overview of asset management practices and how they relate to ancillary asset management today. Transportation asset management, or TAM, can be broadly defined as a tool used by agencies to help them define goals for their assets and prioritize resources in the decision-making processes, especially when those agency resources are limited. TAM is considered a performance-based approach that analyzes available resources and suggests how these resources should be allocated across an asset's life cycle. This may include installation, maintenance, repair, rehabilitation, replacement, operations, and upgrades. Again, this is done through a systematic, documented process that plays into and touches upon a variety of core functions within transportation agencies and entities. To understand how ancillary assets play into asset management plans and processes, this slide includes a generic framework for asset management that breaks down kind of the key steps within the process. So in this generic framework, this includes our first critical step in identifying agency goals and policies. This may be through an entity's mission, vision, or value statements. Next steps include inventorying appropriate asset and asset classes. This is done in part to gather data to perform condition assessments of assets and model their expected performance. By collecting that data and running through expected scenarios, entities and agencies are able to evaluate alternatives against forecasted budgets and ultimately prioritize, select, and implement projects. A final critical step within asset management involves monitoring performance, and this may include both of assets in the field and also of the performance itself. When incorporating ancillary assets into documentations and processes, it's critical that these assets are collected in line with an agency-defined goal as part of that first key step within the asset management framework. This is in part because asset management processes help inform resource allocation decisions in a constrained financial environment. These outcomes help develop tangible measurement of how well available funding is being used to achieve these critical agency goals. TAM frameworks, they are primarily established within agency documentation, such as a transportation asset management plan or a TAMP. These plans act as a focal point for all things asset management, including managed asset classes, strategies, budgets, and other forecasts. While requirements are changing for transportation asset management plans, they do have a requirement right now, including inventory of assets, outlines of assets and program objectives and measures, gap analyses, expected risks and management of those risks, as well as financial plans and other investment strategies. Transportation asset management plans are required for pavement and bridge assets under the National Highway System, or NHS. Transportation asset management programs have decades of experience in managing pavement and bridge assets. And this means that the management of those two more traditional assets is relatively mature and well-defined. As policy changes and state of practice advances, however, requirements are changing. For example, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, states are now required to consider extreme weather and resilience in life cycle costs and risk management. As mentioned, transportation asset management for bridges and pavement assets is relatively well defined, as the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, requires that these NHS assets are managed through a formal plan, the Transportation Asset Management Plan. Agencies have traditionally based their programs, their asset management programs, on these two asset classes. As the state of practice advances and agencies realize the benefits of asset management processes on the assets that they own, agencies are now expanding their programs to include additional assets. These are novel assets from intelligent transportation systems, that's ITS assets, or transportation systems management and operations assets, or TSMO assets, to things such as active transportation infrastructure, including sidewalks and complete streets. As mentioned, states with more mature programs, with more mature asset management programs, are leading the way in tracking a variety of new assets. This slide shows a sample of assets that leading states are tracking across different asset categories and classes. These include things from buildings, facilities, TSMO, lighting, to pedestrian infrastructure and noise walls. So why are we talking about this? Transportation asset management, these principles, the practices are meant to allocate scarce resources, including budget constraints, to best manage assets that agencies own. This is done to achieve a state of good repair across the assets that agencies own and manage. We know these practices provides benefits to agencies, including improved financial performance, and as transportation programs realize these benefits, they're beginning to expand their transportation asset management programs. Furthermore, we're seeing new research and publications from national entities, including FHWA, NCHRP, AASHTO, and others, as well as research from states. And we're actively seeing that the state of practice is advancing in part to respond to new risks to assets, as well as opportunities in managing new assets. So as agencies have traditionally built their asset management programs around bridges and pavement assets, there's less information and documentation about how to manage new assets outside of those two traditional classes. We know that asset management provides benefits to agencies, including things such as financial performance, improved asset health, risk management, and can even include potential safety and operations benefits. Ancillary asset management, so the management of assets outside those two traditional classes, further helps agencies achieve the strategic goals that they have laid out while utilizing existing assets that they already own. Finally, ancillary asset management's key purpose goes back to the age-old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure. So what's the main issue within ancillary asset management? There remains planning for ancillary asset management. This remains the key challenge within the ancillary asset management space. We know that there are benefits and interest in expanding asset management programs to incorporate new assets, given that these practices help agencies achieve efficiencies and goals and financial performance. However, there are a variety of aspects and issues to consider, challenges to tackle when planning for or documenting the processes with which agencies want to incorporate ancillary assets into their programs. Agencies need to consider a variety of factors when incorporating new assets and documenting this within transportation asset management plans. This must be done within the existing constraints and opportunities of the asset management program. As a teaser, there are a variety of key issues to consider, from identifying data collection needs, new performance metrics, prioritizing assets within a program, and identifying changes or resources needed to a program to incorporate these new assets. Further, there's also a benefit cost analysis, or a BCA, consideration of incorporating and requiring new assets when they're managed through a formal process like a transportation asset management plan. Additionally, there are certain asset classes that if a transportation asset management program doesn't have experience managing these asset classes, they present additional challenges and issues. As an example, technology assets or ITS assets, intelligent transportation system assets, present additional challenges compared to bridges and pavements, primarily due to their interconnected nature. ITS assets have considerably shorter service lives than bridges and pavement assets. That being said, they also have a lower replacement cost. If you think about a CCTV camera or cabinet found out in the field, we generally wouldn't expect this asset to have a similar 20-year service life to a pavement asset. However, they are more easily replaced than a fixed bridge or pavement asset. Technology assets are dynamic in nature, and they may require ongoing adjustments and monitoring to ensure adequate usage. Due to technology's backend requirements, including things like software, fiber optics, and data collection and storage, these assets tend to have a greater system-wide interdependencies that will lead to a higher incidence of failure than bridge and pavement assets. All of these things go into what makes technology assets, including ITS assets, such a challenge compared to traditional bridge and pavement assets. So I'm going to hand it back to our moderator, Shri, to introduce my colleague, Dr. Hannah Silber, who will walk us through ancillary asset management themes and principles.
Thank you very much, Neil. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Hannah Silber. Dr. Silber completed her doctorate degree at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where she conducted research in both the Traffic Operations and Safety, which is the TOPS laboratory, as well as Flight Research Lab, a subsidiary of the Naturalistic Decision-Making Lab. She worked primarily on human factors analysis and human behavior as it relates to transportation systems. Her main areas of expertise include human performance, human behavior, and learning strategies, driver simulation research, transportation safety, data mining, and aviation safety analysis. So really strong in many different areas. As a teaching faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Silber has developed and teaches a variety of courses on statistics, engineering economics, human factors, accessibility, and independent studies. As a staff engineer at ARA, she leads and supports a variety of efforts related to human factors, freight accommodations, policy, research program evaluation, and asset management. Hannah, we're really glad you're able to present today, and welcome, and please begin.
Thank you, Shri, and thank you, Neil, for getting us set up for the rest of our discussion. So now that we have a better idea of the transportation asset management processes and this sort of newer area of including some additional assets, let's expand a bit on how to actually incorporate some of these ancillary assets into a more traditional asset management practice. So while an agency may have a lot of the additional assets mentioned, it doesn't imply that tracking all of those additional assets will be the right decision for all agencies. A cost benefit or return on investment analysis would both be effective methods for understanding the sort of bang for your buck, if you will, of what to incorporate into that asset tracking and management practices that are already going on in the agency. And since those assets likely have differing service lives, as Neil had mentioned, they also might have different maintenance cycles. There's some other challenges with looking at the inspection cycles. It might be beneficial to go beyond this cost component and consider which things will fit into the current transportation asset management practices and processes that are already going on in the agency. So we ask questions like, well, what types of ancillary assets does this state or agency have? Can any of those be grouped into categories, maybe by similar service lifespan, maintenance practices, the types of data you could track, how you would collect that data, and so on? If you can add 5 to 6 key assets into a transportation asset management process, all with one method, that's likely going to be a bit more efficient than trying to incorporate, let's say, 20 ancillary assets, but with 10 or more unique ways of tracking or managing those 20 assets. And that brings in some options as well for a bit of optimization work, which as an industrial and systems engineering convert, I always like. And aside or perhaps in tangent with seeing which asset tracking options might fit most seamlessly into existing workflows and processes, agencies can also develop some prioritization or methods of ranking which ones might be most critical to include first, next, in a few years. And this can include the use of methods like prioritization matrices for identifying things based on costs or return on investments or ROI, time or other factors, which assets might make the most sense to add in, again, first, now, immediately, in a few years, never, and things like that. So there's a few different scale examples. Numerical scales, there are a lot of ways to develop numerical ranking systems, which makes them pretty personalizable or customizable for whatever the agency's desires or goals might be. Likert scales are a common example. We can use those numerically or a bit more subjectively, things like rank from 1 to 7, 1 to 10, or you can again do this a bit more qualitatively from least important to moderately important to most important. You can combine a lot of these methods with subjective measures. Even in the development of a numerical scale, some of that ranking will be subjective as well. You can also add a bit more calculative weight behind a ranking method through things like priority score calculating. Priority score calculation will consider the value or the benefit of adding an asset or a class of assets, the urgency, right? How quickly does it need to be completed? How long will it take? The effort and complexity of that risk, as well as the cost to develop this end score. Usually those total scores are calculated using weighted sums. In human factors and user interface design, for example, we sometimes use a method of this called quality function deployment or a house of quality matrix, which has the user identify system goals and then features. So in the case of a DOT or an agency, they have system goals for the system performance when it comes to things like safety and mobility. We think about the relative importance of each feature, in this case, perhaps each class of assets. How do those help accomplish those goals? And then we can calculate that weighted score. Summing rows allow us to see which goals are best or worst served by these features or assets we're analyzing. Summing the columns allows you to see the least and most important features. There are also, of course, tiered methods. The image on the slide here shows an example of a tiered method. And as you might expect, these methods can be combined to create a scale or method that's going to work best for an agency's needs. One big consideration is that implementation of any new method can fail if a process or addition doesn't fit into existing workflows. People and organizations are very resistant to change, so starting with small changes will be important. And processes that fit well into existing workflows or patterns, data collection cycles, maintenance practices, will be the least disruptive to the organization. It's helpful here to ensure that what you're going to collect or track will actually be able to give you answers to those larger organizational questions, such as, are we meeting this performance goal? And how might we improve? A lot of state agencies also differ from one another, and even within an agency from district to district or office to office, there can be a lot of differences or variations in what types of assets that area of the state manages or has, how they might be tracking or using that data. So what may help is to consider some statewide guidelines for how to ascertain what will work best for any given office or work group or unit. However, in terms of how data is collected and how it's stored, the more standardized that is, the more seamless an analysis will become later on, allowing us to hopefully compare apples to apples versus apples to grapefruits. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the data management part as well. Just like agencies will want to know where the pavements or bridges are in terms of those service lives, deterioration, and what might bring them back up to good or acceptable conditions, as well as their resilience to major events like weather events, agencies probably also want to know that for their other assets as well, which is sort of where all of this was born from. For example, here in southern Wisconsin, we recently had a major hailstorm event with really destructive baseball-sized hail, which, while exciting, wasn't so great for a lot of our personal and state assets. But knowing how events like this are going to impact not just pavements or bridge decks, but also CCTV cameras, lights, sidewalks, pedestrian signals, and other elements were going to be really important in understanding how to keep the entire state system performance to an adequate or better than adequate level. And besides weather, risks can also include uncertainty around funding, amounts or timing of funding, impacts of costs, or on costs rather, of economic factors like inflation, losing skilled staff, and along with those skilled staff, losing some of that institutional knowledge, as well as potentially overburdening remaining staff. There can be gaps in data, there can be asset deterioration. All of these areas introduce risk into a system. And when an agency looks at each asset classification or category, they're going to want to understand what risks will impact those asset classes, how that's going to impact their investment or financial decisions that they're going to need to make over a long period of time. Scenario-based planning is also common. So for example, agencies may want to plan options that align with several tiers of funding or investments. If we can't build or spend anything, what does that look like? If the investment amount in this asset class stays the same, what does that look like? If that investment amount is cut by 10%, what does that look like? And a common way to visualize these risks and help create some prioritization or add in that element of ranking of investment options is to use a risk matrix. The image on this slide shows a relatively simplistic one. The nice thing about risk matrices is that they can be really tailored to fit whatever scenario you're applying them to. Whatever you end up including in a risk matrix, the common elements are the severity ratings and the likelihood ratings. In the severity or impact header row, the agency will want to consider how severe would the outcome be if the risk occurred, or how significant is that impact of that risk on operations, safety, efficiency, etc. The impact scale can be decomposed into as much detail as is feasible, but often a 5x5 matrix is sufficient. There's definitely an analysis paralysis component if going too detailed, but the nice thing is that if that happens, you can always walk it back and get back to that sort of 5x5. In this case, with a 5x5, you can consider impact from a 1, which might be insignificant, it won't cause serious injury, illness, impact, all the way to a 5, which would be severe, possibly catastrophic, that could result in fatalities, serious impacts to the system. Then in the likelihood header column, the agency will assess the probability. So how likely is this event or risk to occur, from rare to almost certain? And that probability multiplied by the impact will give you a risk level, which can also take on a numerical value with ranges that result in risk classifications. So in the 5x5 matrix example, where both probability and severity get ranked from 1 to 5, if you were to multiply the probability rating by the impact rating, you'll end up with a numerical risk level score. And then you can start to say, well, scores from 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 are acceptable. There's no need for any special action beyond just control measures. Maybe 6 to 16, we consider that tolerable. We should review it soon, carry out improvement strategies. And then maybe 17 to 25, scores in that range would be unacceptable, and the agency would address those concerns immediately. And of course, you can decompose the risk levels into more categories as needed too. But it allows for some ranking of what to address first, next, in 10 years, if funding allows, and so on. Other challenges, as alluded to before, that come with incorporating additional assets into asset management practices stem from the data. So what data there is, how often to and how to collect it, how to manage it and store it, and then also how to use it. So we end up sometimes with a large amount of data in various fields, especially now that there are a lot of passive data collection methods via CCTV, footage, images, even data you can get from things like Google Maps or Google Earth. But all of that data is not all actually helpful unless we understand how it could be used. And it may take months or years, several freeze-thaw cycles, or whatever the case may be, for significant deterioration to occur in things like pavements. But an ITS asset may need to be inspected more often, or just in the event of failure. And so the maintenance cycles and how to perform inspections, what data should be collected, what's available, may also differ widely across these different asset classes. And it may be hard to accurately catalog all of the existing assets in different classes as more and more of those classes get added to the TAM process. For example, while a state may have been tracking its bridges and pavements for well over 20 years, adding in assets like CCTV cameras, sidewalks, pedestrian signals might require some retro inventorying of what's out there and where, how old it is, how to assess its condition, what condition it's in now, to get some of those rankings or breakdowns that you see in a lot of transportation asset plans that show you what percentage of different asset classes are in good condition, poor condition, etc. And this can lead to incomplete inventories that need updating, which can be daunting and time-consuming. And depending on what's been tracked and how, there could also be duplicate entries in databases, especially if the agency uses a variety of methods for inventorying its assets. If the agency is setting up new classes to be tracked for the first time, it's also important to think about how the data should be collected, what type of data to collect, and then what are the standards for rating asset condition, and ensure those methods and availability of data is transparent across the agency. So there's a couple different options or methods for data collection, and like a lot of things, there's no one best option for everything. Manual data collection, we think about active versus passive collection methods. Manual data collection is a more active method. It's often more time-consuming, involves people going out in the field and taking some type of measurements or observations, possibly photos. There can also be some methods that come out of that, such as video review, which may require people to go out and specifically film or capture something. But also you might ask, well, can any of our traffic cameras or other video footage that's already passively collecting data be used to assess conditions of things like guardrails or sidewalks? This can also be done using things like drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, which is common in inspection of things like power poles. Photogrammetry is sort of a science of creating 3D models from 2D images, usually photographs. So any type of photograph, we can then use some mathematical or geometric principles, go back to your high school geometry and beyond, to analyze and interpret the image, extract some measurements, and then generate some detailed 3D models or representations of images or environments. Along those lines, we also sometimes see the use of mobile LiDAR, light image detection and ranging, which is a form of a pulsed laser that allows for remote sensing for measuring ranges or variable distances, and then also creating 3D maps or digital twins, things that can be used to map the environment and terrain. It can even be used to monitor things like erosion, assess flood risk. And it's common to use vehicles with mobile LiDAR, but you can also utilize airplanes, helicopters. Those can also be useful platforms for acquiring LiDAR data over broad areas. And as that previous slide sort of alluded to, there are a couple of options then when it comes to what you want to do with that data. And if you're using a fix-it-first versus condition-based or reactive approach, which we'll kind of talk about a bit in life cycle planning. But no matter what type of data the agency wants to collect, there will never be one perfect collection method for any one thing or for everything, sadly. So other considerations include how to inspect those different types of assets. Not all of them are going to be visible or accessible via mobile LiDAR, or they might require specialized equipment to inspect. We think about CCTV or other types of cameras could be mounted very high up in various locations. And another important data consideration that we'll talk a bit about now is accuracy versus quality and all of the things that come along with that. So the quality of data is very vital in determining the types of analyses that are possible to perform. We have a saying in industrial engineering in our data science circles, which is garbage in, garbage out. If you collect poor quality or insufficient data, then your analysis will also be poor quality. We don't want agencies spending time and money collecting data that will ultimately not be useful. Sometimes there are really clear metrics for defining good versus bad. What gives a student or a bridge a grade of an A, a B, a C, or a D? Often, ranges of what is acceptable are defined. If you earn between a 93 and a 100, then in statistics, you're going to earn an A. But there are limits to the amount of detail that can be measured at all in a routine inspection. And so you may be able to obtain more detail, but only via more involved or time-consuming methods. For example, consider what you can learn from an X-ray versus an MRI versus a biopsy. Right? All of these options involve different time constraints, costs, and levels of invasiveness, and may not always all be appropriate or feasible options. So we'd like to consider this element of realistic acceptable ranges of reasonable values, and then consider accuracy and precision. So accuracy and precision are terms that often get used interchangeably, but they're a little different. Precision tells us how close each of the measurements are to each other, and accuracy tells us how close each of the measurements are to a true or accepted value. And they're both important for different reasons. We, of course, need accuracy to understand which of our assets are passing or failing, in need of attention or maintenance, but we also need precision to understand how well we are doing at measuring that. This is why it'll be important to adopt some standardized thresholds for good versus bad, standardized methods for collecting data, and we consider the two measurements we get by eyeballing a distance or a weight versus actually measuring it using a yardstick or scale. Those types of things will contribute to precision and accuracy. And precision and accuracy are going to contribute to the quality of data we can collect. Each time we have to reinvent the wheel, we'll end up spending time and money to do so. It can be really hard to visualize or understand how you might want to track something or what should be included in the inventory. And sometimes the fail-safe option is, well, just track everything, keep it all. But that can waste time and effort too. Just like in implementation, as much time as can be afforded in the beginning to understand what to track, what data will be useful, how will it help us answer some of those larger organizational questions later on, will ultimately save time and money. There are, of course, also potential issues of duplicate data, and I've seen this happen often, especially if an item appears in a database, even with just a slightly different name, or even in one instance, some of the names were just misspelled or used different abbreviations, and it resulted in the same exact item appearing in a database more than one time, which prevents accurate analysis. BIM, or Building Information Management, is another option that is common in construction or anytime you're managing materials. It allows architects, engineers, contractors, all kinds of folks to work collaboratively within some 3D models. And this ancillary asset incorporation into TAM can be a good use case for BIM, because you may have within one agency different types of professionals using different components of that data for different reasons, different use cases. Generally, the components that make up a BIM model are intelligent. They have some geometry, they store data. If you change an element, the software updates the model to reflect that change, and that allows the model to remain consistent and coordinated throughout a process, no matter who's looking at it or who's using it. And because these models are often shared through mutually accessible online spaces, it can allow for some quick collaboration throughout an agency or with outside contractors. So that's a lot of information on what you should or shouldn't do with your data, but how might an agency actually develop a really robust data management practice and also better understand what might actually work well for their unique needs? There's a few options here. The agency could certainly pilot a few methods or options. A lot of state DOT offices are split into different districts or regions, and the state could pick one or two of those districts to pilot or test out a data collection and storage or management system for 6 to 12 months, see how well it fits into their existing processes, what hiccups occur, what trouble do people have using or understanding it. Some states are already including ancillary assets into their TAM processes and have some pretty well-defined or developed methods for doing so. So it's also possible to engage in peer exchanges, hear what others are doing, brainstorm ideas together. And many state agencies have research programs, and this area is rich with new opportunities for further research, how this can fit into existing lifecycle planning approaches, which asset classes might be the most critical to track, and things of that nature. No matter what method or approach is chosen, it's going to be important to ensure that the agency is collecting accurate data and that data sets are as complete as possible. We want to ensure that the data collection methods are standardized enough to ensure that the time spent collecting and tracking that asset data provides high quality, usable data with which the agency can make their investment decisions. Similar to implementation checklist strategies that happen before writing research needs statements, agencies will want to consider what data they will track, how they will track it, and also how will they know that those methods of collection, storage, and management are going to be good enough to yield useful analysis later on. And this involves being able to say at the beginning, or maybe even before the beginning, what is good enough? How will we know when we've met our goals? How will we know that the data we're spending time and money collecting will be useful? The other consideration is how to incorporate these assets into lifecycle planning approaches. A lot of agencies rely on lifecycle planning per federal regulations. 23 CFR Part 515.5, and trust me, as a pilot, you end up looking in the CFR for a lot of things a lot of the times. This part tells us that asset management goals include achieving and sustaining a desired state of good repair for our assets over the life cycle of those assets at minimum practicable costs, and that the plan that we develop to do that has to document how that will be managed to achieve state DOT targets for the asset condition and system performance over everything's entire life. And life cycle planning is important because it provides a long-term perspective on the impact of decisions that are going to be made throughout an asset's entire life, from planning and acquisition all the way through disposal. The goals are to find the most cost-effective ways to manage assets over their whole life while maintaining or maybe improving their performance and making sure that those assets can operate to the standards set by the agency. So by looking at the entire life cycle, the agency can anticipate, based on the asset type or class, when it might necessitate repairs, maintenance, what types of risks or events could really require replacement ahead of schedule, and other things of that nature. The life cycle planning also involves considering several options for maintaining or improving asset condition, from preservation, rehabilitation, all the way to reconstruction. But ideally, smaller investments could be made to preserve the conditions, maintain that system performance, to delay or eliminate the need to totally replace or reconstruct. And as an example, here are two examples. The top is from Nevada DOT and the bottom is from Minnesota DOT. Our Nevada DOT graphic shows the impact of the type of maintenance activity on an existing asset condition states. And this is an example with an ITS asset. Let's say it's in good condition. It only requires periodic inspection. If the result of that inspection were to indicate that the asset is a low risk, maybe the agency could make some minor repairs to bring it back up to good condition. If it's a medium risk, maybe it needs more substantial repairs to improve the status to low risk. But assets that are high risk could be converted to a medium risk with some repair work, or possibly returned to good condition if they are replaced. Approaching this life cycle planning like this tends to be a bit more cost effective than a worst first approach, where devices would receive no minor repairs, no maintenance, only be replaced after they fail. And it also provides better overall system performance to have as many assets in good or low risk condition as possible. In the bottom figure, the Minnesota DOT graphic shows a similar example, but a life cycle planning analysis that was done for a dynamic message sign. And the 2019 TAM has a bunch of other ancillary asset examples like this as well. But this shows an example of ITS infrastructure being included into the lifecycle planning. The dynamic message signs lifecycle analysis has two scenarios included. This minimum maintenance scenario, which doesn't include any preventive or reactive maintenance, and the scenario B, which adds a scheduled fan replacement every 4 years, some pixel board replacement every 10 years, some power supply replacement every 13 years. And that scenario B is anticipated to increase the expected life of that asset from 6 years to 16 years. And it also reduces the cost, primarily because of having the sign last over twice as long if there's some inspection or rehab done in the meantime. But it is still important to acknowledge that life cycle planning for assets like ITS assets can be challenging because of technology changes and how those new technologies may change in terms of life cycles or update requirements. So now that we've covered some of those major themes and challenges, we'll just conclude by offering some final guidance on planning for the incorporation of these ancillary assets into TAM processes. The landscape within which agencies operate to achieve organizational goals like safety, mobility, efficiency, environmental conservation, and so on has really evolved in the past 20 years. And with that, what is needed to help agencies achieve those goals or know if they're achieving them has evolved too. The inclusion of ancillary assets is not just additional work for additional work's sake. It allows for the ability to get a more comprehensive picture of what is happening within the agency and how they can continue to make modifications to better achieve their goals and manage risk. But as we've discussed, some of those new asset classes are very different from pavements and bridges, especially ITS assets in terms of life cycles, maintenance needs, how to inspect them, the types of data you can collect, and so on. Additionally, the risks that agencies must consider in that risk management process are also evolving and might vary widely by asset classes or categories. However, it's still important to know that time spent considering risk management and mitigation, data collection, data management and storage, and how to use that data to better maintain or improve system performance will be beneficial. Identifying which data elements will be critical in TAM planning and beginning that process now will also be beneficial. As the landscape continues to evolve, it's not unlikely that the TAMP requirements may also evolve to require the inclusion of certain asset classes beyond pavements and bridges. The exploration and testing of things like centralized databases of all of this additional data will also be beneficial for making sure that that data quality remains high, to cut down on duplicate or incorrect or incomplete entries, and to ensure more seamless access across the whole agency. And don't forget, garbage in, garbage out. The time and effort spent on ensuring data quality is high from the beginning is always time and effort well spent. High quality, complete, accurate data allows for more robust, more thorough, and more comprehensive analyses, which ultimately will help our agencies make smarter and more informed decisions about how to keep their assets in states of good repair and keep the entire system operating well. And with that, we'd like to acknowledge the Missouri DOT and specifically our project panel members, which helped make all of this research possible. And now I'll turn it back over to Shri.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was a great presentation from you and also from Neil James. You may now begin submitting your questions in the chat box, and Neil and Hannah will answer as many questions as possible in the time remaining. Let me talk a little bit about our upcoming webinars. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation and that you will join ARA for future webinars. On June 25th, Leela Sushita Chinnakotla will present Developing a Pavement Marking Management System, a North Texas Tollway Authority case study. It's a case study presentation. And then on July 16, 2025, our colleagues, Robert Bell Isle and Jeff Hines will present on From Simulation to Mission Execution, how VICE and MPMS work together to enhance mission success. So as you can see, we have quite a variety of topics that we present on webinar Wednesday. Let's get to the Q&A portion. And by the way, we do have many topics that we're working on for the rest of the year. So stay tuned and to our webinars and also on our Webinar Wednesday webpage, www.ara.com/webinars, where you can register for these webinars. So let's get to the Q&A portion of the presentation. And I'm just going to put the questions out there, and Hannah, you and Neil can kind of chime in and respond as you see fit. The first question is from Thomas. Are there any state DOTs currently privatizing or planning on privatizing the maintenance of transportation asset management assets through performance-based asset management / maintenance contracts? So I don't know which one of you want to answer that. And I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think. I'm sure that it's on some folks' radar. There's nothing that comes to mind for me specifically, but I'll see if Neil has anything or any agencies that he knows of that for sure are considering or even trying out privatization of that process.
I think there's aspects within asset management that agencies are doing on contract-based work with private agencies, such as data collection across kind of an asset's life cycle. Certainly, there are things that are more aspects of asset management that lend themselves more towards what a state DOT is already doing.
All right, thank you for your answer. Next question is from Abu. How would a state or agency identify all the possible risks that they should account for in their risk management process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll field that one to start just because I teach about this a bit in one of my graduate courses. And the answer is you can't. So there's you can definitely decompose this into so much detail that it becomes not efficient anymore. And so it's helpful to think about the different common categories of risks, whether that be one's based on cost or funding, one's based in nature, weather, and things of that elements. And then within each of those, think about things that are going to be most commonly impacting your agency or your assets. But there's no way to account for every single risk that could ever happen. But one of the things to consider is that even by going through risk management processes and doing some proactive risk analysis and mitigation, you're hopefully building in some system resiliencies, layers of protection in your system, so that if things do happen, you have more sort of layers of protection against those things happening, resulting in catastrophic failure. It's sort of similar to the way that we build airplanes, right? Why do airplanes have two engines? Why do they have all these backup systems? It's because you can't plan for all of the risks. You know, for example, like you might hit birds, you might have this happen, you might fly through hail, you might whatever. But you can't plan for everything. But what you can do is build an aircraft that even if some of those things occur, there are backup systems or other protections that mean that when things go wrong, it doesn't result in catastrophic damage or failure. Neil, anything to add?
I wouldn't add too much more that, as you said, it is not always feasible or possible to identify all the possible risks that should be accounted for within, risk management and asset management. But sometimes some of the risks even that are commonly associated with asset management, such as funding uncertainties, changes in funding for fiscal years, things like weather records. These agencies can begin to understand what might be coming in the future by talking with and having discussions with other offices and divisions, and also with leaderships to understand future impacts. Further, looking at maintenance records especially within like technology assets, to understand what's gone wrong can provide some input into what might go wrong in the future.
Yeah, thank you both. Hannah, Neil, so, when myself being from the payments area, I'm focused primarily on payments and maybe some geotechnical assets. So my mind was blown when I saw all of these additional assets that you talked about. So could you spend a little bit of time telling us and the participants what states are doing a lot of these additional ancillary asset management, and what are they doing in this area, and what assets are they currently tracking, and what assets maybe are not being tracked as much?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Neil. You can. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about the complete streets part.
Sure. I can start us out. A lot of times it's asset management programs, as they become more mature, get more resources, they begin to track different things that are of importance to their state. For example, California is a big one that currently incorporates complete streets into their asset management processes. This was done as part of a House bill in California that complete streets need to be considered on all projects over a certain amount of funding. So that lends itself to incorporating that into asset management. So the reasons that state DOTs incorporate different aspects, different ancillary assets vary depending on kind of the context of the DOT. Minnesota is another state that is leading the charge in tracking ancillary assets. Michigan is tracking ancillary structures. But again, the reasons why and the methods that they are doing so differ by state. Really, it matters about finding a method that fits into the existing processes of their program.
Yeah, I would say or expand on that by just saying, like, for example, in Minnesota, they, in their 2019 transportation asset management plan, they kind of acknowledged that there were a lot of other assets that they're required and responsible for maintaining too, and that they have a direct sort of ownership role in some of those roadside assets or traffic infrastructure and some of their ITS assets as well, sign panels, sensor systems, but even like pedestrian bridges and bicycle facilities. And of course, they may have to look at that from a different perspective than someone like California because of those different types of environments and risks. You know, California may have more seismic activity to consider, different types of climates, and Minnesota certainly will have a very sort of challenging climatological consideration because they can get 12 inches of snow and have really cold weather, but then also have really hot, humid summers. So the way that they have to go about some of that planning or they can expect out of those different assets' life cycles could really be different from other states.
Thank you both. So would a state have to collect all of this new data themselves, or is there any data that is already potentially available to the states?
State might begin talking with some of local partners. For example, your MPO or a local agency may already be collecting certain data or have done data collection around an asset that you may be considering. This may reduce the burden of thinking about what data fields you want to collect around a new asset that you're trying to incorporate into an asset management program. Again, peer exchanges are another method to begin to understand more of that data management characteristics around certain asset classes. So yeah, talking with locals and then also talking with peer states, I think is a first step in understanding what data is collected, what data is out there, and what data fields are most appropriate for certain asset classes. Hannah, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just agree with you on that and say that I think sometimes it's helpful to look back on other types of work that's been done and see if there's any sort of more passive ability to get data out of that. Just as one example that came to mind for me was there was a project that I was involved in when I was still in grad school that was looking at guardrail condition across the state of Wisconsin. And it was using a lot of sort of passive methods to do that by using traffic camera and other footage of areas on the highway nearby the guardrails to see if they were intact, if the sort of key structural elements were there, if things need to be replaced. And so what it involved is kind of looking back at a lot of data that was already collected as part of something else to then sort of mark or highlight areas or guardrails that needed replacement or attention. So sometimes looking back at what's already been done in other research work might show you that you already have some data available that you can use to at least get started. And again, like Minnesota's 2019 TAMP example, they have some state highway system assets that they're including, and they have some of the information ready, like the unit or the count and the replacement value, but they haven't got around yet to the determining current asset value part. And it's still a work in progress, but they're at least acknowledging that it's important to consider in the planning process for the future.
Yeah, thank you. That's great to know they don't have to start from scratch. I think I'll have one last question and then we'll end the webinar. This last question is from Stephen, and it's a little bit of a long question, and I'm going to read it out. Incorporating ancillary assets into documented management processes can be a challenge, especially with ITS and other technology assets. However, rest areas and ancillary structures are also asset classes representative of ancillary asset management. Does this imply some states aren't tracking anything when it comes to those assets?
So sometimes agencies may own assets and they may be managed on more of an ad hoc basis. This doesn't mean that those assets aren't being managed, aren't getting kept up into a state of best repair that they can. However, they aren't a part of the dedicated transportation asset management plan. They may not have performance measures associated with them. They may not be communicating, the condition with stakeholders. So it doesn't mean that they're not tracking anything. It just means that these asset classes may not necessarily be part of the dedicated transportation asset management plan or processes. Hannah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. I think that you're correct in that it's just that they aren't doing it maybe as formally as is it maybe required when including it into a transportation asset management plan or planning process. So maybe it's more ad hoc, as Neil had implied, that the highway crew goes out to an ancillary asset like a storage shed for salt or sand. They notice things that are wrong or that need to be repaired, and then it's more reactive. Versus in the TAM process, we're saying we're trying to be proactive and consider a long range formal way to do that. So yeah.
All right, thank you both. And one last question from me. So what are your favorite assets, Hannah and Neil?
Hannah, go ahead.
Oh man, I was gonna steal yours, but I won't. So I'll pick a different asset. I guess I'll say CCTV, just because I feel like it not only helps you see what's going on traffic management style, but it feels like in all those investigate discovery shows, they also use it a lot of times to solve crimes. So it's kind of dual purpose, which I like in an asset.
All right, and for those of you who don't know, we're calling in from Madison, Wisconsin, which is a big bike infrastructure city. So I'm a big bike commuter, and I really enjoy pedestrian flashing beacons, as I like cars to be able to see me so I don't get hit on my way to work.
Awesome. Mine is bridges, because every time I drive over it, I'm kind of surprised that it can hold the whole truck and not fall down, but that's just me. All right, we're wrapping up our webinar. Thank you very much for attending. If Neil and Hannah have agreed to answer any questions for the next 24 hours via email, their email addresses are shown: edsilber@ara.com and njanes@ara.com. We just ask that you please make sure your questions are not of the consulting nature. I mentioned PDH certificates at the beginning of the webinar. So again, today's presentation is being recorded, and a link will be made available on ARA's Webinar Wednesday website sometime in the next few weeks. We will also send a PDH certificate to all participants as verified by our attendance report and as being present for the full hour of the webinar. And a copy of today's presentation will also be included in that email. Please allow at least 3 weeks to receive your certificate. ARA is a great company to work for, and it's very unique in that it's 100% employee owned. So we continue to grow dynamically and are always looking for great people to join our team. And so if you're interested in employment opportunities within ARA's transportation and infrastructure offices, please send a brief resume and contact information to www.joinara@ara.com. Thank you for joining today, and we hope you will join us on June 25th for our next Webinar Wednesday, developing a pavement marking management system, North Texas Tollway Authority case study. Thank you very much. All have a great rest of the afternoon.